The numbers are staggering. An estimated 12.5 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic, enduring the horrors of the Middle Passage. What drove this insatiable demand for human labor? And with its diverse array of traditions, why did Africa become entangled in the brutal currents of the transatlantic slave trade? These questions echo through the corridors of time, demanding our attention as we embark on a journey to dissect the complex forces that made Africa the epicenter of one of the darkest chapters in human history. In the midst of the enormous human tragedy, a puzzling mystery remains. A mystery that encourages us to examine the political landscape, economic needs, and social divisions that work together to make Africa the selected place for enslavement. As we peel back the layers of history, we uncover a story that transcends time and speaks to the very essence of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Number 1. From African practices to European expansion. The initial reason for bringing slaves from Africa during the era of transatlantic slavery can be traced to the prevalence of established slave systems on the African continent. Before the Atlantic slave trade, Africa had its own slavery system, and Europeans could easily get slaves by offering more than what African and Arab buyers were willing to pay. The Europeans usually wanted male slaves, while in Africa and the Near East, they preferred females who could do a variety of jobs and have children for their owners. The Portuguese were the first Atlantic slave traders due to a labor shortage in their American colonies. Spain couldn't buy slaves in Africa because of a treaty, so they depended on foreign merchants. Portugal didn't invade Africa, but set up forts along the coast for trade. After 1600, the English, French, and Dutch broke the Iberian monopoly and also established colonies in the Americas. As demand for African slaves grew, the English West Indies shifted from growing tobacco to sugarcane, and it became harder to get European indentured laborers. By 1600, the English and French were already involved in the slave trade. The French initially relied on Dutch slavers, but later, both countries formed their slave trade companies. The English created the Royal African Company in 1672. Even though the Dutch had started earlier, big monopoly companies weren't always better. The first Atlantic slave trade circuit was dominated by Portuguese and Portuguese-Brazilian slave ships, but other European nations could still smuggle slaves into Spanish America. A second circuit emerged in the 18th century, involving slave ships from various European nations. The 18th century demand for slaves led to over 3 million slaves being landed, especially in English, French, Dutch, and Danish colonies. In contrast, Brazil and Spanish America received a similar number of slaves in the 19th century, reflecting differences in plantation agriculture development. Plantation expansion in the Caribbean, particularly in English, French, Dutch, and Danish colonies, was fastest in the 18th century. Brazil and Cuba had peak expansion in the 19th century. Slave imports not only fueled plantation growth, but also compensated for the natural decline due to high mortality. North America was an exception, experiencing strong growth in the slave population around 1800, making up 30% of all slaves in the New World, despite receiving only 3.6% of the slaves during that time. Number 2. Economic imperatives and the emergence of the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade, driven by economic needs, became a sad part of human history. It happened because there was a strong demand for cheap labor to work on the valuable plantations in the Americas. In the 16th century, as European powers sought new avenues for wealth accumulation, Africa became a focal point due to its abundant resources, particularly ivory and gold. The establishment of colonies in the Americas in the early 1500s marked a crucial moment. Vast plantations were cultivated for cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, relying on a large and inexpensive labor force. Ivory and gold in Africa became attractive commodities for European traders, leading to the systematic enslavement of millions. The transatlantic slave trade, officially commencing in the mid-15th century, transformed human beings into commodities. West Africa, including present-day Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria, became epicenters for the capture and sale of enslaved individuals. Fortified trading posts along the African coast facilitated the exchange of goods for slaves. The economic impact of the transatlantic slave trade extended beyond trade routes, shaping the economies of the Americas. Plantation economies, heavily reliant on the forced labor of enslaved individuals, produced cash crops crucial to European wealth accumulation. The profitability of these crops was inseparable from the brutal working conditions, high mortality rates, and dehumanization of those subjected to forced labor. Enslaved individuals were denied basic human rights, defined as chattels, and treated as personal property. The dehumanization justified the inhumane treatment, facilitating the exploitation of their labor for economic gain. Abolitionism emerged in the late 18th century as a challenge to the entrenched economic interest of the slave trade. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, formed in London 1787, marked a turning point. African writers and activists, including Olaudah Equiano, spoke out against the trade. Abolitionists like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson campaigned for the end of the transatlantic slave trade, emphasizing its moral and humanitarian dimensions. Despite abolitionist efforts, economic interests defended the trade's importance to Britain's economy. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 marked the end of the transatlantic slave trade, but nearly 750,000 people remained enslaved in British colonies until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. Full emancipation occurred in 1838, but the decision to compensate plantation owners with £20 million while providing no reparations to the formerly enslaved underscored persistent economic disparities. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade extended to Africa, where internal conflicts and power struggles were exacerbated by the demand for enslaved individuals. The British West Africa Squadron, established in 1808, sought to suppress illegal slave trading. This marked a shift in focus towards dismantling the economic interest that fueled the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade, driven by economic imperatives, transformed the fortunes of nations, fueled industrialization, and reshaped societies. Its economic, social, and cultural impacts endure, reflected in persistent disparities and systemic injustices. The transatlantic slave trade stands as a stark reminder of the ethical complexities embedded in economic systems and the enduring struggle for justice. Number 3. The Middle Passage, a Voyage of Horrors. The Middle Passage was a harrowing journey that subjected enslaved Africans to unspeakable horrors as they were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. This transatlantic leg of the triangular trade, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas, was marked by overcrowded ships, the brutal separation of families, and shockingly high mortality rates due to disease and maltreatment. The staggering number of lives lost during this traumatic odyssey serves as a haunting testament to the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. The conditions aboard the slave ships during the Middle Passage were nothing short of appalling. The ships, often overcrowded to maximize profits, crammed hundreds of enslaved individuals into very confined spaces. The lack of adequate ventilation and sanitation turned the vessels into breeding grounds for disease, contributing to the devastating mortality rates. The inhumane treatment meted out during this journey dehumanized those aboard and left an indelible mark on the collective memory of humanity. The Middle Passage was characterized by the separation of families, a heart-wrenching aspect that added an additional layer of cruelty to an already horrific experience. Families torn apart, children separated from parents, husbands from wives. The slave traders callously disregarded the bonds of kinship for the sake of their economic gains. This deliberate disruption of familial and cultural ties inflicted profound psychological trauma on the enslaved individuals. The journey's timeline spans several centuries, with its peak occurring from the late 16th to the 19th century. During this period, countless Africans were forcefully transported to the Americas, with estimates suggesting that approximately 12.5 million individuals endured the Middle Passage. The 18th century, in particular, witnessed a surge in the volume of slave trading ships, reflecting the insatiable demand for enslaved labor in the expanding plantation economies of the Americas. The mortality rates during the Middle Passage were shockingly high, with death becoming an ever-present specter for those aboard. The appalling conditions on the ships, cramped quarters, poor diet, dehydration, and the spread of infectious diseases created a lethal environment. The transatlantic voyage claimed the lives of an estimated 2 million Africans, a staggering toll that highlights the brutal and dehumanizing nature of the trade. One notorious example of the horrific conditions aboard these ships is the Zong Massacre of 1781. The Zong, a British slave ship, faced a shortage of drinking water for the enslaved individuals on board. In a shocking display of callousness, the ship's crew decided to jettison a significant number of enslaved Africans overboard to conserve water. The Zong Massacre, while not an isolated incident, stands as a chilling illustration of the disregard for human life that characterized the Middle Passage. The horrors of the Middle Passage were not confined to physical suffering alone. Psychological torment accompanied the enslaved individuals throughout their journey. The traumatic experiences of being captured, confined, and transported under brutal conditions left enduring scars on the minds and spirits of those who survived. The psychological impact extended to the generations that followed, contributing to the collective trauma of African diasporic communities. Efforts to resist the inhumane conditions of the Middle Passage were not uncommon. Enslaved individuals demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. Some engaged in acts of rebellion, ranging in small-scale uprisings to more organized and large-scale revolts. These acts of resistance, while often suppressed with brutal force, underscored the indomitable human spirit in the quest for freedom and dignity. The abolitionist movement in the late 18th and 19th centuries played a crucial role in bringing attention to the atrocities of the Middle Passage. Abolitionists such as Alauda Equiano and William Wilberforce tirelessly advocated for the end of the transatlantic slave trade. The Middle Passage stands as a dark and haunting chapter in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. The appalling conditions, separation of families, and shockingly high mortality rates reveal the depths of human cruelty and exploitation. The journey across the Atlantic was marked by unimaginable suffering, leaving an indelible scar on the collective memory of humanity. Remembering the horrors of the Middle Passage is not only an acknowledgement of the historical injustices, but also a commitment to ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. Number 4. Enslavement in the Americas. Plantations and dehumanization. The institution of slavery in the Americas primarily involved the enslavement of Africans. The enslaved workforce, legally treated as chattels, formed the backbone of plantation economies, working on plantations to produce key commodities such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar. The The individuals subjected to slavery were of African descent, and they endured harsh labor conditions, denied basic rights. Nearly 2/3 of the enslaved population worked on sugar plantations, where high mortality rates were prevalent. Despite the adversity of slavery, African cultural elements endured, contributing to the emergence of new, hybrid cultures and traditions in the Americas. The legal dehumanization of the enslaved workforce was starkly evident in their classification of chattels, reducing them to mere property with no rights or agency. This legal framework facilitated the exploitation of their labor for economic gain, shaping the harsh realities of plantation life. The cultivation of tobacco, cotton, and sugar emerged as economic imperatives in the Americas, driving the demand for enslaved labor. Plantations, particularly in the southern United States and the Caribbean, became the epicenters of this exploitative system. The profitability of these cash crops was intricately linked to the forced labor of the enslaved individuals. The 16th century witnessed the rise of tobacco cultivation in the Chesapeake Bay region in North America. The demand for this highly profitable crop fueled the expansion of plantations, and enslaved individuals were coerced into laboring under grueling conditions. The profitability of tobacco cultivation, coupled with the relentless demand for cheap labor, set the stage for the entrenched system of slavery in the American colonies. As the American colonies expanded, so did the demand for enslaved labor, particularly in the cultivation of cotton. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the emergence of the Cotton Kingdom in the southern United States, fueled by the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Cotton became a crucial cash crop, and enslaved individuals were systematically exploited to meet the insatiable demand. However, it was sugar plantations in the Caribbean that became synonymous with the brutality of plantation life. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, the Caribbean islands were at the heart of the sugar trade. Enslaved individuals toiled in the fields under the scorching sun, enduring back-breaking labor to cultivate and harvest sugar cane. The harsh conditions on sugar plantations led to staggeringly high mortality rates among the enslaved workforce. The combination of exhaustive labor, poor living conditions, and exposure to diseases took a devastating toll on their lives. The mortality rates on sugar plantations were so severe that enslaved individuals often faced a life expectancy of only a few years after arrival. One infamous example of the brutality on sugar plantations is the Jamaican Maroon Wars in the 18th century. The Maroons, consisting of escaped enslaved individuals, waged a series of guerrilla wars against the British authorities. These uprisings were fueled by the desire for freedom and a rejection of the inhumane conditions on sugar plantations. The Maroon Wars exemplified the lengths to which enslaved individuals went to resist the oppressive system. Despite the dehumanizing conditions, enslaved individuals managed to preserve elements of their African cultural heritage. The transference of knowledge, traditions, and languages among the enslaved created a rich tapestry of hybrid cultures. From the Gulag Geechee communities in the southeastern United States to the Afro-Caribbean traditions in the Caribbean islands, the resilience of African cultural elements endured. Music, dance, and religious ceremonies became powerful outlets for expression and cultural preservation. In the face of adversity, enslaved individuals created new forms of artistic expression that blended African and European influences. The emergence of genres like the blues and jazz in the United States and various forms of Afro-Caribbean music stands as a testament to the enduring cultural legacy of the enslaved workforce. Religious practices also played a crucial role in preserving African cultural elements. Despite the forced conversion of Christianity, enslaved individuals infused their traditional beliefs into Christian rituals, creating syncretic forms of worship. This blending of religious practices not only provided solace and community, but also served as a subtle act of resistance against the cultural erasure imposed by slavery. The story of the enslaved workforce is one of struggle, survival, and the indomitable spirit that transcends the dehumanizing confines of slavery. Remembering this history is not only an acknowledgement of the resilience of those who endured, but also a commitment to understanding the complexities of cultural survival amid systemic oppression. Number 5. Resistance and struggle for freedom. In the face of the dehumanizing shackles of slavery, the enslaved individuals demonstrated unwavering resilience as they fought to preserve their families, cultures, and dignity. The struggle for freedom took various forms, spanning from subtle acts of resistance to organized uprisings that echoed the indomitable spirit of those yearning for liberation. Resistance efforts were pervasive throughout the era of slavery, showcasing the profound determination of the enslaved. Breaking tools became a common form of protest, a subtle yet impactful way to thwart the relentless demands of plantation owners. By rendering tools useless, enslaved individuals disrupted the economic machinery that relied on their forced labor. Organized uprisings represented more overt acts of resistance, with enslaved individuals courageously challenging the oppressive system. One notable example is the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina. During this uprising, a group of enslaved Africans seized weapons, killed several plantation owners, and attempted to escape to Spanish Florida, where they believed freedom awaited. Although the rebellion was suppressed, it reflected the boldness of those who refused to accept their subjugation. The formation of maroon communities stands as a testament to the enduring struggle for freedom. The self-sufficient and independent communities were established by escaped enslaved individuals who sought refuge in remote and often inhospitable areas. The Maroons skillfully navigated the challenging terrain, creating bastions of resistance that persisted for years. One notable example is the Windward Maroons in Jamaica, who successfully resisted British forces for decades, showcasing the formidable spirit of those who dared to defy the chains of slavery. The quest for freedom extended beyond physical resistance. Enslaved individuals also fought to retain their cultural identity. Music, dance, and religious ceremonies became powerful means of expression and cultural preservation. The retention of African cultural elements in the New World, despite the brutal attempts to erase them, highlighted the tenacity of the enslaved individuals in safeguarding their heritage. The enduring legacy of these acts of resistance reverberates through history, reminding us of the indomitable spirit of those who sought freedom amid the oppressive forces of slavery. The struggle for liberation, whether through subtle defiance or overt rebellion, left an indelible mark on the collective narrative of resilience in the face of adversity. The establishment of maroon communities and the preservation of cultural elements stand as enduring testaments to the human capacity for resistance and the unwavering pursuit of freedom. Number 6. Abolition, a long and arduous journey. The journey toward the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a protracted and challenging struggle, marked by the moral imperatives that fueled the abolitionist movement in the late 18th century. Prominent figures, such as Olaudah Equiano and William Wilberforce, played crucial roles in this movement, vehemently speaking out against the inhumanity of enslavement. Olaudah Equiano, an African writer and former enslaved person, used his literary prowess to provide a first-hand account of the brutality of the slave trade. His autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, published in 1789, became a powerful tool in raising awareness about the harsh realities faced by those subjected to enslavement. Equiano's advocacy contributed significantly to the growing abolitionist sentiment. William Wilberforce, a British politician and philanthropist, emerged as a key figure in the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. As a member of Parliament, Wilberforce tirelessly advocated for the abolition of the trade, presenting evidence of its cruelties and emphasizing the moral imperative to end such a dehumanizing system. His relentless efforts culminated in the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which made the slave trade illegal in the British Empire. While the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 marked a pivotal moment in the fight against slavery, it did not bring an immediate end to the institution itself. Slavery persisted, and it took additional measures to address the deep-rooted system of bondage. The Emancipation Act of 1833, also known as the Slavery Abolition Act, was a landmark legislation that signaled the culmination of decades of activism and struggle. The Emancipation Act of 1833 declared that slavery would be abolished in most British colonies, marking a significant milestone in the broader movement for freedom. However, the road to complete emancipation was complex. The act stipulated a transition period known as apprenticeship, during which formerly enslaved individuals were required to continue working for their former masters for a set number of years. Full emancipation, where individuals gained their freedom without any further obligations, did not occur until 1838. The journey toward abolition was indeed long and arduous, shaped by the persistent efforts of abolitionists who fought against powerful economic interests and deeply ingrained social norms. The moral imperative to end the inhumane practice of enslavement spurred a movement that, over decades, achieved significant milestones, but also faced setbacks. The eventual triumph of abolition reflected the resilience of those who tirelessly advocated for justice, equality, and the inherent dignity of every human being. Conclusion: the transatlantic slave trade, with its roots in economic exploitation and human suffering, shaped the course of history. The journey from the Middle Passage to abolition reflects the resilience of human spirit and the triumph of justice over cruelty. As we confront this painful legacy, it becomes imperative to acknowledge the enduring impact of the descendants of those who suffered and to strive for a world that upholds the principles of equality, dignity, and freedom for all.